What would you do if your own home, your sanctuary, became enemy territory overnight? If the person who lived next door wasn't just a bad neighbor, but a nightmare wrapped in pastel cardigans and self-righteous fury? I didn't have to wonder. I lived it. For years, my suburban neighborhood had been the perfect place to call home. Quiet, well-kept, the kind of place where people waved when they passed, even if they didn't know your name. It wasn't exciting, but that was the appeal: no drama, no chaos, just peaceful predictability. Then Debbie Whitmore moved in, and overnight, the neighborhood felt like a war zone. It started with the small things. She'd stop me in my driveway, her arms crossed tight over her chest, lips pursed like she'd just sucked a lemon. "Ethan," she'd say, stretching my name out like a scolding mother. "You really should do something about those weeds near your fence. You don't want to bring down property values, do you?" At first, I humored her. A harmless busybody, I figured. Every neighborhood had one. But then the HOA notices started rolling in. First, a warning about my mailbox being non-standard, even though it had been there for 5 years without complaint. Then came the citation for my grass being overgrown, despite it being neatly trimmed like every other lawn on the block. Debbie wasn't just a nosy neighbor, she was using the HOA as a weapon. Then came the real obsession. My pool. One afternoon, I caught her in my backyard. Just standing there, arms folded, staring at the water like it had personally offended her. I stepped outside, already irritated. "Debbie, can I help you?" She turned, eyes narrowing behind her oversized sunglasses. "This pool is disgusting," she declared. "Do you even maintain it?" It had been professionally cleaned just the week before. The water was crystal clear, the tiles spotless. But Debbie didn't care about facts, she cared about control. "You realize this could be a health hazard, right? Stagnant water attracts mosquitoes, and who knows what kind of bacteria is growing in there?" I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to stay even. "It's clean, Debbie. Professionally maintained. You don't need to worry about it." "Oh, but I do," she said, stepping closer, lowering her voice like she was letting me in on a terrible secret. "You see, I've spoken to the HOA about it. And they're concerned too." That's when I realized what was happening. This wasn't just casual nosiness, Debbie was laying the groundwork for something bigger. I just didn't know yet how far she was willing to go. The next few days passed in a tense, uneasy truce. Debbie didn't say much, but I could feel her watching me. Every time I stepped outside, her blinds would twitch, or I'd catch the shadow of her figure on her porch, arms folded, lips curled in disapproval. I knew she wasn't done, but I wasn't prepared for how far she would take things. One morning, a neighbor, an older man named Mr. Calloway, waved me down as I was leaving for work. His face was tight with worry, and he held a clipboard in his weathered hands. "Ethan, I thought you should see this," he said, handing it over. "She came by yesterday asking for signatures." I frowned as I scanned the paper. It was a petition to have my pool removed. Debbie had titled it something dramatic: Community Safety Initiative, Eliminate the Harper Health Hazard. According to the petition, my pool was a breeding ground for disease, and a threat to neighborhood children. I scoffed. "This is ridiculous. My pool is professionally maintained." Mr. Calloway raised a hand. "I know. I didn't sign it, but I saw her going door to door. And Ethan. I recognize some of these names. But a few of these people have been out of town for weeks. I don't think they signed this." I tightened my grip on the clipboard. She was forging signatures now. Anger burned in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. The HOA wouldn't actually take this seriously. They'd have to investigate, right? But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Debbie had connections. She was the kind of person who talked loud enough to make people listen, even when she was spewing absolute nonsense. I was still fuming about the petition when the knock came at my door that afternoon. A loud, authoritative thud. When I opened it, 2 uniformed police officers stood on my porch. "Mr. Harper?" The taller one, Officer Mitchell, adjusted his sunglasses. "We received a complaint about a hazardous condition on your property. Specifically, an unsanitary swimming pool that poses a public health risk." It took me a moment to process. Then I let out a humorless laugh. "You've got to be kidding me." The shorter officer, Carter, exchanged a glance with his partner. "Sir, we have to check. It's protocol." I exhaled sharply but nodded. "Fine. Come on." I led them to the backyard, where the pool sparkled under the afternoon sun. The water was pristine, a mirror of blue reflecting the sky. I crossed my arms as the officers inspected it. Mitchell dipped a test strip into the water, watching it turn the appropriate shade. "Looks fine to me," he muttered. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable screech of Debbie Whitmore. She appeared at the edge of her yard, hands planted on her hips, expression triumphant. "See? See? I told you it was contaminated." Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, the water's perfectly clean." Her expression flickered, but she doubled down. "You don't understand. He's probably tampering with the results. That water is a festering pit of bacteria." Carter sighed. "Ma'am, do you have any actual proof of that?" "You can smell it," she insisted, taking a deep, exaggerated inhale like a bloodhound. Carter's face remained blank. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we're standing right next to it, and it doesn't smell like anything." Debbie's face turned a shade of red I didn't think was humanly possible. Her eyes darted between the officers and me, her mouth working as if trying to piece together an excuse. "You're all in on it," she hissed, voice shaking. "You're protecting him because, you know why." The air grew heavy. That unspoken accusation hung between us, thick and poisonous. She didn't need to say the words out loud for everyone to understand. Officer Mitchell exhaled sharply, adjusting his belt. "Ma'am, we're going to have to ask you to stop making false police reports. Wasting department resources is a serious offense." "Wasting?" Debbie nearly choked on her own outrage. "I am protecting this neighborhood. He's the menace, not me." Carter's patience had clearly run dry. "Ma'am, you need to calm down." But Debbie wasn't done. She turned back to me, eyes glinting with something unhinged. "If you think you've won, Ethan, you're wrong. This isn't over." I should have known then. Debbie wasn't the type to back down. She was the type to escalate. And the worst was yet to come. I thought that after the police dismissed her complaint, Debbie would finally get the message. That maybe, just maybe, she would feel embarrassed enough to let it go. But people like Debbie don't let things go. They double down. At first, I noticed small things. My pool, which had been crystal clear, started looking off. A strange cloudiness, like someone had dumped something into the water. I shrugged it off at first, maybe it was just an issue with the filter. But then, it happened again. And again. By the end of the week, the water had turned a sickly greenish hue overnight. I called my pool guy, and he was just as baffled as I was. "This shouldn't be happening, Ethan. I just cleaned it last week. Your levels were perfect." I racked my brain, trying to figure it out. Then it hit me. Someone was messing with my pool. And I had a good idea who. That night, I went to a hardware store and bought a motion-activated security camera. I installed it on the side of my house, aimed directly at the backyard. If Debbie was sneaking onto my property, I was going to catch her in the act. The next morning, I checked the footage. What I saw made my blood run cold. There she was. Debbie. She was sneaking into my yard at 2 a.m., dressed in black leggings and a hoodie like she was starring in the world's most pathetic heist movie. And she wasn't alone. She had backup. A man, another neighbor, one of the weaker-willed HOA members who always seemed terrified of Debbie. His hands were full of unlabeled chemical bottles. They moved quickly. Debbie whispered orders as she unscrewed the caps, and the man poured the contents directly into my pool. The two of them stood there for a moment, watching the water ripple in the moonlight, before scurrying back through the fence. I rewound the footage and watched it again, rage simmering just below my skin. Debbie wasn't just harassing me, she was actively sabotaging my property. The HOA, the police, the fines, they weren't enough for her. She wanted proof that my pool was contaminated. And when she couldn't get it, she manufactured it. I wasn't about to let her get away with it. That afternoon, I took the footage straight to the police station. Officer Mitchell, the same cop who had come to my house before, sat across from me, arms crossed as he watched the video play out. His jaw tightened as Debbie's grainy figure poured chemicals into my pool. When the footage ended, he let out a slow breath. Well, that's about as clear-cut as it gets. I leaned forward. What can you do? First, we'll need to test your water. If she actually tampered with it, that's vandalism. And since this is deliberate property damage, she could be looking at criminal charges. Finally, she was going to face real consequences. Later that evening, I walked outside just in time to see Debbie standing in her yard, smug as ever. "Your pool's looking a little murky, Ethan," she called, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Maybe you should be more responsible with your maintenance." I just smiled, knowing what was coming. "Oh, don't worry, Debbie. I've got everything under control." She didn't know it yet, but her little reign of terror was about to come crashing down. The next morning, I was outside with a cup of coffee when I spotted the patrol car rolling slowly down the street. Debbie must have seen it too because she stepped onto her porch, eyes narrowing as Officer Mitchell and another officer, Carter, exited the vehicle. She folded her arms, radiating the confidence of someone who truly believed she was untouchable. I waited, letting the moment stretch, letting her think she was about to enjoy another battle where she got to play the righteous victim. Then, Mitchell turned, not toward me, but toward her yard. "Mrs. Whitmore," he called, voice firm. "We need to speak with you." Her smugness flickered, but she held her ground. "About what?" Mitchell gestured toward me. "Mr. Harper has provided video evidence of you trespassing onto his property and tampering with his pool. We've also tested the water. The chemical levels were dangerously high, which suggests deliberate contamination. That's vandalism, ma'am." For the first time since she moved in, Debbie looked genuinely stunned. Her mouth opened, then closed again as if she were searching for the right words. Then, like a switch flipping, her shock morphed into outrage. "You've got to be joking," she scoffed. "You're taking his side? That video could be anything. It's probably doctored." Mitchell didn't so much as blink. "We're well aware of video evidence protocol, ma'am. And the test results don't lie." She let out a sharp laugh, voice rising. "This is a joke. A setup. He's the one with the dirty pool. I was trying to protect this neighborhood." Carter took a step forward. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to calm down." But Debbie was already unraveling. "You're all against me. I see what's happening. This is bias, this is discrimination. I have rights." Then, as if to prove some kind of point, she stormed toward my yard. Before anyone could stop her, she kicked off her sandals and hurled herself into my pool. I barely had time to process what I was seeing before she was thrashing around, splashing violently, screaming at the top of her lungs. "Look at this filth," she shrieked. "He's poisoning us all. This water is toxic. The officers stood frozen for a second, probably just as stunned as I was. Then Mitchell let out a long breath and reached for his radio. "Control, we're going to need backup." Debbie was still kicking, still flailing, acting like she was being drowned by invisible forces. She scooped water into her hands and threw it toward Carter, deliberately splashing him. "There. You see? It's full of chemicals. It burns," she screeched, though all she accomplished was getting her blouse drenched. That was the breaking point. "Ma'am," Mitchell said, voice sharp, "you are now trespassing, resisting a lawful order, and interfering with a police investigation. I'm placing you under arrest." Debbie must have thought they were bluffing, because when Carter grabbed her arm and tried to pull her out of the water, she fought back. She thrashed. She screamed. She kicked at Carter's leg and actually spat at Mitchell. They had no choice. It took both officers to drag her, soaking wet, out of my pool. She was flailing like a child throwing a tantrum, kicking and cursing as they forced her arms behind her back. "You can't do this," she screeched. "I know my rights. You'll regret this." I stood there watching, my phone out, recording every second. By the time the second patrol car arrived, she was still screaming, still throwing accusations, digging herself deeper. I could hear neighbors gathering now, watching from driveways and porches. By the time they stuffed her into the back seat of the patrol car, Debbie Whitmore's reign of terror was over. The aftermath of Debbie's arrest spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People who had spent months, or even years, silently suffering under her rule finally spoke up. Stories poured out about her weaponizing HOA regulations, filing false complaints, and intimidating anyone who dared to challenge her authority. The HOA, desperate to salvage its reputation, quickly distanced itself from her, removing her from the board and revoking several of the ridiculous rules she had enforced. It turned out I wasn't the only one who had been a target, just the only one who fought back. Then came the final, beautiful twist of karma. During the investigation, the city did a routine property inspection and discovered that Debbie's own backyard was a disaster. Overgrown weeds, rusting furniture, and a rotting deck that was an actual safety hazard. The same HOA that she had used to harass me slapped her with multiple violations. She had been so focused on controlling others that she had ignored her own mess. Now, she was the one being fined. With legal fees, HOA penalties, and the public humiliation of being the subject of a viral meltdown video, Debbie had no choice but to sell her house and leave. One morning, just weeks after her arrest, a moving truck pulled up to her driveway. She was gone by nightfall. The neighborhood changed overnight. People relaxed. No more ridiculous citations, no more HOA threats, no more passive-aggressive notes left on doorsteps. For the first time in months, I could enjoy my own home without looking over my shoulder. I even installed a taller fence, not just to keep future Debbies out, but as a personal reminder that some boundaries should never be crossed. As for me, I don't regret standing up to her. If anything, I wish I had done it sooner. Bullies thrive on fear, and people like Debbie count on silence to keep their power. But when someone pushes back, they crumble under the weight of their own entitlement. So, have you ever had a HOA nightmare or dealt with a Karen who made your life hell? Share your story below. I bet we could start a whole survival guide.